An early childhood memory of mine is of sitting by a window on a rainy day watching the drops splash against the pane. I must have been around 9 or 10 years old, and like all normal children, I spent most of my life racing around on roller skates or playing different ball games. But at this particular moment, I was still, and my mind had time to drift. I remember a series of questions popping into my head. Why can I think? Why do I exist? Why am I a living, breathing, conscious being who experiences life? I don't remember where the questions came from. They seemed to come from nowhere, seemingly unprompted. I know I'm not the first to have this kind of moment. Whenever we sit still for long enough, all kinds of things bubble to the surface of our consciousness. It seems that conscious awareness is central to what it means to be a living, breathing human being. But what is a human being? The question, am I just my brain, asks a question of human identity. What exactly are we? Are we merely advanced apes? Are we machines? Are we souls temporarily housed in a body that will one day float off to heaven? Are we just physical beings, or is there more to us? If I were to spend some time asking people, what is the defining feature that makes you, you? There might be a range of different answers. Some people might say that the central most important thing about them is their relationships, their community, their family. Others might say that it is their experiences, the things that they've learned in life, good and bad. These have shaped them into the person that they are today. Other people might say that the defining feature that makes them, them, is their career, their purpose, their influence. Today I want to look at the line of thought that says that the central and most important thing about you is your brain. Now, clearly the brain plays a key role, but this view is more strongly put. It says that your brain defines you. You are your brain. The choices that you make, for good or ill, the personality that you have, the behaviours you exhibit, even the religious beliefs that you may or may not have, these are all dictated by the activity of your brain. After all, we live in an age of neuroscience and are gaining ever more knowledge and understanding about the structure and function of the human brain. I had the privilege of spending over 10 years in the field of functional MRI research in both the UK and the USA. Techniques such as fMRI are extraordinary and have greatly helped this whole field because they provide a way of looking inside the human body without cutting into it. Brain imaging techniques have been used to study the neural networks involved in various mental and cognitive tasks. They've been used to study the impact of disease states and also the influence of drugs on the brain. There are even studies on religious belief asking what happens in the brain when people pray. This is an area of research known as neurotheology, where neuroscience and theology intersect. But do the discoveries of neuroscience mean that everything that it is to be a human being can be explained entirely in terms of brain chemistry and electrical activity? After all, some brilliant scientists believe this. Francis Crick, who co-discovered the DNA double helix and won the joint Nobel Prize along with James Watson, said at a later time in his book The Astonishing Hypothesis that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. I wonder what you think about this view. Is it true that we are simply packs of neurons? Is this the best story that can be told about human identity? And of course, if human consciousness is purely material, then in theory one day it could be generated artificially. Those working in AI make a distinction between weak and strong AI. Weak AI is artificial intelligence that focuses on a specific pre-programmed task given by a human being. Strong AI refers to algorithms that can perform all of the same tasks as human beings and possibly even possessing human levels of consciousness. And of course, the question that some are asking is, will human levels of consciousness, strong AI, eventually be possible in machines? The intelligence of an algorithm has typically been measured using the Turing test, a test developed by mathematician Alan Turing in 1950, in which an algorithm and human are both asked a series of questions and an interviewer examines the answers from both. If the level of complexity of answers from the algorithm is indistinguishable from the human, then they are said to have passed the Turing test. And there are many, many examples today of algorithms that have fooled interrogators into believing they were human. But just because a machine appears to be conscious, does this mean that they are conscious? Our interactions with some forms of AI can give the impression that they have a mind of their own. But a famous thought experiment posed by philosopher John Searle, known as the Chinese room, argues that the Turing test does not necessarily speak to whether or not an algorithm is conscious. Searle asks us to imagine the following scenario. Imagine person A passing Chinese messages to person B, who is inside a closed room. Now, person B has no knowledge of the Chinese language. All they have is a book of Chinese symbols that they use to decode the messages coming in and to send a reply out. Now, to person A, outside of the closed room, it seems like person B speaks Chinese, but that is not true. All that person B can do is process Chinese characters. Searle's point is that the ability to process information, albeit in a very accurate and efficient way, is not the same as having a conscious self, an inner life, an inner reality. Ultimately, the answer that we give to the question, am I just my brain, determines what we believe will be possible one day with AI. If we are just our brains, then conscious androids are in theory possible. But if we are more than just our brains, then even the most elegant and sophisticated algorithms will never replicate human consciousness, even if they have the appearance of being human. AI has greatly advanced in the last few decades, benefiting many areas of life, including finance, healthcare, transportation, agriculture, and education. AI has been used to combat crime, to detect cancer, to dispose of bombs, to dispense drugs, and the list goes on and on. But these are all measured in terms of their speed, efficiency, and accuracy. And yet, when we think about what it means to be human, we don't think in terms of speed, efficiency, and accuracy. We can't really reduce being human to a series of tasks. In fact, the things that make us most human, that we value most, are not related to tasks at all. We value relationships, being known and loved, being listened to, and being understood. Perhaps most centrally of all, humans have an inner world, a conscious mind, a sense of self that needs some explaining. You see, many would agree that it is not enough to simply talk about the brain. We also need to consider the mind. You see, there are two different things at play here. There is the brain with all of its cells, electrical activity, synapses and chemicals. And then there is the mind with all of its thoughts and feelings and emotions, memories and decisions. In addition to a brain, we each have an inner world, an inner reality. We each have a unique first-person perspective on the world. As philosophy professor Thomas Nagel put it in 1974, there is something that it is like to be you. We are conscious beings. And so what is the relationship between the mind and the brain? This really is the question that sits at the heart of this whole conversation. And the problem is this: how do you get from brain cells to thoughts, from electrical activity to what it is like to be you? How do we bridge this gap between the brain and the conscious self? Or, as Baroness Professor Susan Greenfield once said, how does the water of boring old brain cells and sludgy stuff translate into the wine of phenomenological subjective experience? In other words, how do you get from water to wine? And how we get from brain reactions to conscious experience has occupied philosophers and scientists for centuries. And there are many atheists and agnostics today and through history that recognize that this is a hard problem to solve. In fact, today, philosophy professor David Chalmers has named it the hard problem of consciousness. Now, the perspective driving some of this conversation is that the mind and brain are essentially the same thing. This is broadly known as reductive physicalism, in which the mind is reducible to physical processes in the brain. Mental states are brain states. Mental processes are brain processes, which is another way of saying that there isn't really anything that it is like to be you. There is only brain activity. But this view has the potential to undermine everything that we think and say and do. If we are just our brains, then every thought that we have, every opinion we express is not coming from us, but from forces beyond our control inside our skull. And if they're not coming from us, then how can we trust these things or ascribe any meaning to them? I recently gave a talk in a school and remember taking a question afterwards from a student who stated that he didn't believe in free will, that everything was driven by the activity of our brains. My response to this student was to ask him, why are we even bothering to have this conversation? Was he asking me to assume that what he just expressed was coming from him or coming from forces beyond his control inside his head? You see, if we are just our brains, then meaning becomes entirely eroded. There are also big implications for free will. If we are just our brains, then our actions are driven by our neurons. And therefore, how can we be held morally responsible for anything that we say or do? And yet we seem to live as though there is a you and a me. We hold views and opinions that are taken to mean something because they are our views. We have law courts that punish criminals, exam boards that award degrees, and committees that give medals to war heroes, precisely because those actions were taken by the person, not by their brain. And therefore the person can be held morally responsible on that basis. And so chalking everything down simply to brain chemicals doesn't seem to be enough. We need a deeper level of explanation for human beings. What the science has shown us is that mind and brain are connected. If you put someone in an MRI scanner and give them an activity that uses their mind, you will see many different brain regions light up. Mind and brain are clearly connected. But just because they are connected does not necessarily mean that they are identical. Let me try and show you why this is the case. Imagine it was true that we lived in a purely material universe and that all we have at our disposal are material descriptions. Suppose then that I asked you to describe to me the smell of coffee. What would you say? You might offer me the chemical structure of caffeine, and that would be very interesting and elegant, but it wouldn't get me any closer to the smell of coffee. Or you might describe to me the physiology taking place as I drink this coffee and digest it. And again, that will be fascinating, but it wouldn't get me any closer to the smell of coffee. In order to access the smell of coffee, we need to smell it. There's actually no other way. And this is an example of a quale, or in the plural, qualia, which is a term that philosophers use to describe qualitative experiences that are impossible to describe physically. And life is full of qualia. Things like seeing colours, tasting fruit, and perhaps the biggest qualia of all is the experience of what it is to be you. Imagine we were to conduct an experiment to find out what it's like for you to revise for your next exam or go through your next project or audit at work. And we were to put on an EEG cap and measure some 24-hour continuous signals from your brain. Perhaps we would also put you in an MRI scanner and take some structural scans and functional scans at different points during this time. Would the information from your brain tell us what it is like for you to go through that exam season or through the next audit at work? Not at all. It might provide some very interesting data, but it doesn't tell us what it's like to be you. Measuring someone's brain doesn't tell us what's going on in their mind. The only way to access a person's mind is if they choose to make it known to us. For this reason, many scientists and philosophers, both agnostics, atheists, and Christian theists, believe that brain processes and human experience are two very different things. Brains don't think. People think using their brains. And there are better ways of describing human beings than simply viewing them through the lens of their brain. Ways that agnostics and atheists subscribe to as well. I talk about these in more depth in my book, Am I Just My Brain?, if that's something you might be interested in. So what are some of these alternative views? Well, one view is that the mind emerges from the brain. In other words, the brain generates the mind. This view, known as non-reductive physicalism, holds that when a number of physical brain building blocks come together, something new comes into being that is greater than the sum of its parts and that can't be reduced back to physics and chemistry. Take the example of a movie. A movie has a number of key building blocks. It has a script, a cast, a director, a soundtrack, a camera crew, and so on. If we were to remove any one of these, then the full movie wouldn't exist. And yet when we watch a movie, we are not thinking about these individual building blocks. The film is experienced as a whole. And the non-reductive physicalist view seeks to make sense of the observations from science and from the clinic that show that mind and brain are very clearly, strongly connected, and we need a model that makes sense of this close connection. One proponent of this view is Professor Nancy Murphy, who describes it in this way. Our core theme is a monistic or holistic view of humans. Statements about the physical nature of human beings made from the perspective of biology or neuroscience are about exactly the same entity as statements made about the spiritual nature of persons from the point of view of theology or religious traditions. In other words, biological, psychological, and spiritual observations are noting the same phenomenon, but from different perspectives. Every viewpoint, of course, has its challenges, and the challenge facing those that take an emergentist or non-reductive physicalist view is this: how exactly does the brain generate the mind? How exactly do neurons generate thoughts, especially for those that don't believe that God exists and that all we have to work with is matter. No amount of biochemical complexity seems to get us any closer to human experience. We are still faced with the hard problem, and the chasm between the brain and the mind still has to be crossed somehow. Of course, there are several Christian theists who hold this view and believe that because God exists, there is more at our disposal than simply matter, and therefore there is hope for crossing the brain-mind chasm. A second alternative view says that the mind is beyond the brain. This view argues that there are two kinds of substance, that the mind is a non-physical substance and the brain is a physical substance. These two substances are distinct, but they interact very closely. It's a view referred to as substance dualism, traceable to the ancient world, but also voiced in the 17th century by mathematician and philosopher René Descartes, and held by a number of key philosophers today. For example, Professor J.P. Morland has said that the brain is a physical substance that has physical properties, and the mind or soul is a mental substance that has mental properties. The soul and brain can interact with each other, but they are different substances with different properties. And so this view says that human beings cannot simply be explained in terms of physical systems. There is also a non-physical dimension. But the question that substance dualists have to wrestle with is this: how can a non-physical mind interact with a physical brain? What does that mean? And how do we make sense of observations from science which seem to show these two things being very much integrated rather than being separate entities? Every view has its challenges, and that is the challenge facing the substance dualist. A third and final alternative view is a view known as panpsychism, from the Greek pan meaning all and psyche meaning soul. This view turns the whole debate on its head and asks the question, what if consciousness is fundamental to the cosmos? Panpsychists argue that trying to make sense of the mind through the building blocks of the brain gets us nowhere. Instead, we need to build a theory around the assumption that there are levels of consciousness in every living thing, from the atomic scale right up to human beings. Proponents of this view include Professor David Chalmers, who has said that a theory of consciousness should take experience as fundamental and construct a theory of experience. Another proponent is Philip Goff, who posits many things, including that even electrons and quarks have unimaginably simple forms of experience. One of the challenges faced by panpsychists is in how to make sense of the very distinct levels of consciousness in human beings, even compared to the most advanced apes. Another challenge lies in trying to account for the unity of conscious experience. If there are simple forms of conscious experience even at the atomic scale, why do we have one integrated conscious experience rather than many trillions? These are questions that a panpsychist must wrestle with. It's important to remember that all of these mind-brain models are philosophical positions, none of which can be verified scientifically. The science can only tell us that mind and brain are closely connected, as mentioned earlier, but it remains neutral on the nature of that connection. Any position taken sits in the realm of philosophy. Of course, it's important to be aware that the presumed backdrop to the sciences is materialism, the view that matter is all that there is. And this philosophical position leaks into scientific interpretation all the time. For example, in 2017, the front cover of an edition of Scientific American had the very catchy title of How the Mind Arises. with an equally attractive subtitle of How Network Interactions in the Brain Create Thought. This really caught my attention because there is no scientific study that can be conducted to warrant the conclusion that network interactions in the brain create thought. Network interactions correlate with thought, perhaps, but create? No. This subtitle was not a scientific statement, but a philosophical one that assumes that the brain creates the mind. And yet here it was on the front cover of a scientific journal, masquerading as a scientific discovery. And this is something that we are seeing all the time in terms of how scientific data is reported and how it's interpreted. And it's very important for us to be aware of when the boundary between science and philosophy is being crossed. This is happening all the time. And we are made in the image of this God. In other words, we have a mind because God has a mind. We think because God thinks. It is deeply ironic that Christianity is seen by some as being anti-intellectual, but in fact we can make the opposite case. The very mind that we use in the pursuit of any kind of knowledge or understanding makes far more sense if God exists than if he doesn't. George Wald, Nobel laureate in physiology and medicine, summed it up well. He said, mind, rather than emerging as a late outgrowth in the evolution of life, has existed always as the matrix, the source and condition of physical reality. That the stuff of which physical reality is constructed is mind stuff. It is mind that has composed a physical universe. So, are we just our brains? Far from it. Neuroscience can answer many questions about the brain, but not every question about our humanity. The fact that we are more than just our brains gives us great hope for many areas of life. First, there is hope for our relationship with artificial intelligence. If we are more than just our brains, then there will always be something irreplaceable about being human. Our relationship with AI ought not to be one of fear, nor of using it to manipulate, nor to dominate, but of seeking to harness and steward this technology in responsible ways. Second, there is hope for human dignity. If we are just our brains, then everyone over the age of 18 is on a downward trajectory. But if God exists, it's possible for people to be rooted and grounded in something or someone that isn't in flux or in a state of degeneration. There is an identity that runs far deeper than our physical bodies. There is a you and a me that is unchanging, even if our bodies and brains change. 2 Corinthians 4:16 tells us that though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day, and therefore we do not lose heart. Third, there is hope for relationship with God. The mind is crucial to knowing God. It's precisely through the life of the mind that we find ourselves asking big questions of life. Questions like those I asked as a child. Questions like, why can I think? Why am I here? Is there a God? And if so, what is he like? The Christian faith is clear that God is a person, ultimately made known in the person of Jesus Christ. And he can be known in very real ways, and the mind is a vital part of that. And it's why we are encouraged to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind.